So you finally upgraded that webcam of yours, you've got your hands on a fancy new DSLR or mirrorless camera. However, are you a little bit overwhelmed by all the dials and buttons and how everything works with it? Well, today we're going to go over a few basic settings and how you can get the most out of your brand new camera. Before we get started though, my name is Andrew. I am a professional filmmaker, content creator, and a streamer on Twitch. If you guys have any other questions or queries related to these videos, remember to drop me a comment down below, like and subscribe to the channel, and I'll be uploading and making videos like this as much as I possibly can. So I'm assuming that you've already got your camera set up and at least plugged into your PC. First things first, get that camera turned out of automatic mode, put it into movie mode, and make sure that all your settings are currently set to manual. Shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. These are the three main settings you're going to be dealing with when working with DSLRs and mirrorless cameras. If you can get these three settings set up correctly, you're going to end up with the best image possible out of your camera. Let's start with shutter speed. In film and photography, the shutter speed or exposure time of the camera is the length of time that the sensor or film that you're using is exposed to the light. This effectively will change the overall exposure of your image. However, I wouldn't actually choose to use the shutter speed to change the exposure for film and video, due to the fact that if you change the shutter speed one way or another, it's going to affect how blurry or sharp your actual image looks. For example, if you've ever seen those time-lapse videos of cars driving at night where they have like the tail lights are blurry and driving off into the distance, that's an example of a slow shutter speed, and you don't really want that blurriness in video, especially when you're talking and moving around too much, unless it's for some kind of effect. And on the opposite end of the scale, if you've ever seen a film called Saving Private Ryan, you'll have seen the use of high shutter speeds. And there's a very famous scene within that film, the Omaha landing beach scene, where it looks hyper realistic, super sharp, and everything is really crisp and beautiful. That is an example of a high shutter speed. However, I would also avoid using high shutter speeds, because as good as it is in that movie, it's not done for the entire amount of time. So if you're using high shutter speeds for your stream, it can become quite taxing and exhausting to watch, because, well, everything just has no blur to it and it looks very unnatural. So if you can't have slow shutter speeds and you can't have fast shutter speeds, what are you meant to do? Well, generally when it comes to film work and video work, the rule of thumb is that you should have double whatever your frame rate is. So if you're streaming and gaming online, I'd imagine that you're shooting your games, recording your games in 60 frames per second. So your shutter speed should be set to double that, which is 1/120th of a second. So that'll be the 1/120 shutter speed on the back of your camera. Moving on from shutter speed though, the next thing you should be looking at and changing the settings of to get the best out of your camera is the aperture. So if you look on the back of your camera, the aperture is represented by the f value on the screen. So you can change it from a really low number like f1.4 to something like f32, depending on what lens you have attached to your camera. Much like shutter speed though, the aperture doesn't just affect the exposure of the image, it also affects how the image itself looks. And I'm going to imagine that the reason you got one of these fancy cameras with a nice lens on it is to be able to mimic how other people look and have that nice soft blurry background behind you. The aperture is the setting that you need to change to create how blurry or non-blurry the background of your image is. As a general rule of thumb though, the smaller the f number on the back of the camera, the more blurry and soft the image is behind what it's focused on. Take this lens for example, I'm currently shooting on f2.8. That's not the lowest number you can possibly get, but for me, as you can see in this image, it's creating this nice soft blurry background behind me, and also helps separate me from the rest of the room behind me as well. However, if you're shooting at a higher f number like f16, which is what I have this lens set to now, you unfortunately get rid of that separation and soft blurry background that we had with the lower f numbers earlier on, which sadly gets rid of the cinematic, more professional, better looking image, which is probably what you're after with this kind of camera on your stream. You may have noticed that that clip looked quite different to all the other ones that are within this video, and that's mostly because I had the aperture set to f16. Not only does that get rid of the blurry background like we were talking about, it also makes the overall image darker. So to compensate for that, I had to turn my light, the brightness of it, up to over double what it was before, which sadly makes the background look darker while exposing my face correctly. So my advice to you as a streamer is, if you've got one of these fancy cameras with a nice lens on, basically set the f number to the lowest number you can possibly have. It'll let in the most light possible, which also makes the image quality look the best it can possibly look, and also you'll get that nice cinematic, movie, professional, blurry, soft background, which is what everyone wants from one of these cameras. So set your f number as low as possible and you'll be very happy with how it looks. Which brings us on to the last in the trifecta of camera settings, what we're going to be talking about today, and that is ISO. Effectively, ISO is how sensitive the camera sensor is to light going into it. So the lower the ISO number, the less sensitive; the bigger the number, the more sensitive it is to light. Think of it as fake light. So say you've set up your studio, you've set up your stream setup, the lights are on, the lights are as bright as possible, your aperture's open as wide as possible, and your shutter speed is the correct amount for the frame rate that you're shooting in. However, your image is still slightly underexposed and a bit dark. Then you're gonna have to play with the ISO, change the setting of that, make it a little bit brighter, so that your image looks correctly exposed and you look good on camera. You may be asking yourself, why not just bump the ISO up? It doesn't really matter about lights and whatnot though, but ISO does come with a slight caveat. Basically, the higher the ISO, the more noise and grain that's going to get introduced into the image, which effectively will make this image look worse over time. So the higher the ISO, the worse it's going to look. The lower the ISO, it's going to look better. So you need to find that balance between having enough light physically with light and also having enough ISO to make it exposed correctly while not looking like trash. Thankfully, most modern cameras are decent in low light these days, so you can kind of bump the ISO up a little bit, but not too much. I would advise not going any more than 1600 ISO. Anything past that on these new modern cameras is probably just going to look really noisy and grainy and look rather terrible on camera. So yeah, stick with as low as possible, but no more than 1600 ISO. Anyway, I hope this has helped somewhat. I understand this can be quite confusing and a lot to learn all at once, but it's definitely worth taking the time to learn this so you can get the most out of your camera. And as I said, this is just a basic overview of what the settings are about. There's a lot more that goes into it and setting it up as an actual like professional career type thing, but for stream you just want to keep it simple and make things look nice as much as possible. Ultimately though, anything that's kind of creative and artistic is, well, it's subjective. So obviously if you don't agree with something that I am saying, you can play around with the settings, see what you come up with. You might end up liking things a little bit different to how I suggested. So have a play around with these settings, get to know your camera, and just learn what you like. Anyway, thanks for watching as always, guys. I'll put some links down below to the equipment that I have been using. If you enjoyed this video though, give me a like. If you have any questions or queries or suggestions, please leave them in the comments down below, and subscribe to the channel for more, as I'm going to be uploading as much as possible, hopefully weekly. I will see you all in the next one though. Have a great one. Night Owl out. Peace! Oh, he's driving away. Got him.